Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. Georgia likes to present itself as a success story, a post-Soviet reformer, an EU candidate, a country that chose Europe and left its authoritarian past behind. But in 2025, that story is getting harder to tell. Opposition leaders are being jailed, rival parties face extinction, and voting rights are quietly being narrowed, all in the name of stability and constitutional order. The question is no longer whether Georgian Dream is dismantling democratic checks, it is whether it can actually replace them with something durable. Because building a dictatorship is one thing, making it last, especially in Georgia, is something else entirely. So, without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Georgia's democracy is facing one of its most serious tests since the country regained independence from the Soviet Union, as the ruling Georgian Dream party tightens its grip on power and stifles political opposition. It was once a post-Soviet success story with ambitions for European integration. Now, the country has turned to authoritarianism. Recently, the country's authorities kicked off criminal cases against leading opposition figures and legal efforts aimed at banning major opposition parties. Observers say these steps rely on a judiciary that lacks independence and serves the interests of the ruling party. Civilian life has also come under pressure. Protesters have been detained or fined, media outlets are facing a regulatory crackdown, and new laws have curbed NGOs' ability to operate freely. Government officials say these measures are necessary for stability and national security. This turn of events has alarmed Georgia's European partners, and the country's EU accession prospects are now uncertain.
Following the last year's European Council conclusions that the Georgian government's actions have de facto led to a halt of the pre-accession process, and in light of Georgia's continued backsliding on the fundamentals since then, the Commission considers Georgia a candidate country in name only.
Without meaningful political competition and independent institutions, elections risk becoming a mockery of the democratic process. What will remain is a country in which democratic norms formally exist, but their power will be all but gone.
And now, let's zone in on the East-planning portion of our show. Georgia's political transformation is not something that happened overnight. It is a process that took place gradually over several years, and many see it as a textbook example of democratic backsliding.
Observers say that the Georgian Dream party consolidated power by systematically capturing state institutions rather than dismantling them outright, as is often the case in authoritarian countries. Crucial to this process was billionaire Bidzina Ivanishvili, the party's founder and power broker. Controlling courts, law enforcement agencies and major media outlets permitted the government to shape narratives and sideline its critics. Laws branding NGOs as foreign influence increased the crackdown over the organizations and discouraged activism. Opposition figures have faced legal pressure, business leaders critical of the government are often intimidated, and journalists are warning of growing censorship. Meanwhile, pro-Western political forces were portrayed as destabilizing actors rather than democratic alternatives. Although elections are still being held, observers argue that the playing field is no longer fair. Changes to electoral rules and media access have weakened the opposition while maintaining the appearance of democratic legitimacy. Georgia's case shows how modern authoritarianism often relies less on overt repression and more on institutional control, messaging and legal tools to capture power.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. In 2025, Georgia looked like a country accelerating towards authoritarianism, but not quite sure where it wants to stop. Arrests of opposition leaders, attempts to outlaw rival parties, pressure on civil society, and restrictions on voting abroad all point in one direction. Yet, the regime that Georgian Dream seems to be constructing is not a hardened dictatorship in the Belarusian or Azerbaijani sense. What is emerging instead is something messier, more fragile, and potentially reversible. A model of managed democracy that relies less on total repression than on exhaustion and fragmentation. Over the past year, Georgian Dream has significantly escalated pressure on the opposition. In early November alone, prosecutors opened criminal cases against 8 opposition figures, accusing them of crimes ranging from sabotage to attempts to overthrow the constitutional order. Even under the government's own disputed election results, these factions collectively won 49 seats in the 2024 parliamentary elections. The subsequent boycott of parliament has only reinforced Georgian Dream's narrative that the opposition is irresponsible, destabilizing, and fundamentally illegitimate. This framing now underpins efforts to turn Georgia into a de facto one-party state well before the next elections in 2028. For years, Georgian Dream was constrained by the promise of EU integration and by the reputational cost of openly authoritarian behavior. Now the party sees an opportunity to consolidate power more decisively. All of this suggests a country sliding rapidly towards full-fledged dictatorship. Georgia's trajectory resembles not Belarus or Azerbaijan, but countries like Serbia, where periods of controlled stability are punctured by sudden large-scale mobilization. Georgian Dream may jail opponents, ban parties, and may be moving towards autocracy, but it's not yet on a one-way road. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Grigol Yurihize, a professor of international relations from the Caucasus University. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So looking back at Georgia, the tail end of 2025, the country was widely seen as a democratic success story after the Rose Revolution and again in the early 2010s. What happened? What specifically institutional political vulnerability allowed the current government to reverse that trajectory so quickly and thoroughly?
I would say that a lot of things are happening right now in Georgia, but these developments are often seen mistakenly. Yes, the change is often misunderstood. What we are seeing is not an ideological turn away from Europe, but a gradual deprioritization of value-based alignment in favor of regime stability and risk minimization. Formally, the European course remains intact, but practically, engagement with the European Union has become selective and transactional. This is not unusual for small states operating under pressure from multiple geopolitical directions. Georgia is not moving towards Russia in an ideological or strategic sense. What is happening is an attempt to avoid confrontation with Moscow while simultaneously limiting Western leverage over the domestic political processes. The paradox is that by distancing itself from Western conditionality, Georgia unintentionally creates space where Russian interests can benefit indirectly. I would describe the current situation as selective pressure rather than classical repression. The state increasingly using legal, administrative, and financial instruments to manage political uncertainty rather than eliminate, let's say, a pluralism outright. Georgia is still formally, I would say, democratic and still formally maintains democratic institutions, but their autonomy is becoming more constrained. And the trajectory, of course, is quite pessimistic because in this region, in this very dangerous geopolitical region, staying alone with authoritarian forces and entities and I would say actors, international relations actors like Russia, China, and Iran cannot and will not lead to brighter perspectives.
So what you're saying essentially is instead of actually outright aligning with Russia, it's more like a power vacuum leading Russia to kind of fill the space. But then we also see things like the foreign agent law, which is touted by a lot of people as being a very kind of Russian-style, pro-Russian type of even described as a late-stage instrument of a longer consolidation process. What is the timing and implementation of this bill about the regime's strategic goals?
First of all, we have to understand that the main task of the Georgian Dream ruling party is to keep the power and influence in this country. And the Foreign Agents Bill was one of the main instruments in this regard. It created legal basis for the Georgian Dream to eliminate unwishful political actors or entities or even individuals by increasing pressure. Of course, it has the reasons why they decided to shift their geopolitical orientation. There are three factors. First, regional instability, particularly the war in Ukraine, has increased the perceived cost of confrontation. Second, fatigue with Western conditionality and constant reform pressure. Third, internal consolidation of power ahead of critical electoral cycles. And the combination of these issues gave the comfort and gave the, I would say, privilege to the Georgian Dream to act based on their very selfish interests. And the cost is paid by Georgia itself, because the deterioration of relationships with the strategic partners and the fortification, I would say, economic and political leverage of Moscow directly hits the country's pro-Western orientation, and the instruments like Foreign Agents Bill and the so-called reform of higher education institutions create a very solid background and legislative basis for further fortification of political power, which automatically leads to more isolation of this country.
All right. Well, you brought up these 3 points. I want to further dissect them a little bit. The part about regional instability, of course, is self-explanatory with the war in Ukraine taking place. But what I find interesting, and I think a little bit of nuance to unpack, is what you mentioned about the fatigue of the West. Now, the way that the EU, as well as the collective West, is trying to deal with the Georgia situation right now is to put more pressure on it. And having these discussions, usually it is focused around how the West can either through sanctions or through any other means put pressure on the country as well. Do you think that this might have the unintended consequences of further this sort of fatigue and sentiment which kind of drove it into this isolation in the first place?
There is one important element that right now the West, more specifically European Union, holds in regard to Georgia. This is a potential suspension of visa-free regime, which is used as the nuclear weapon against the decisions and actions of the Georgian Dream. But in the long run, I would say that if this decision is taken, and I really hope that such a decision will not be taken by the decision makers, it will strengthen the leverage and influence of Russia, because while I monitor the Russian media, they are always underlining and focusing on the issues like Georgia is already abandoned, that Georgia was deceived by the Western institutions, which is a very standard modus operandi from the Kremlin textbook. And if such decision is taken, I would say that Russian propaganda and potentially the propaganda of the Georgian Dream will use it as an attempt to blackmail Georgia. And this vacuum of power will be filled, of course, by the further actions of other authoritarian countries. That's why I would say that right now, the European Union and the United States of America are operating in the regime of reactions, which means that they are already late in this regard. And frankly speaking, I don't see any tangible mechanism in the near future that might lead to the reconsideration by the Georgian Dream of their foreign policy and the actions within Georgia. And the complexity of this issue makes me say that in these dark times, especially in the South Caucasus, I would say that the level of uncertainty plays positively in terms of the interest of ruling party. That's why I think that the European Union and the United States of America, which is less and less interested with Georgia, are already late in terms of taking decisive steps.
All right, a bleak look ahead. And to the third point that you mentioned about the internal consolidation of power, can you help us understand how the balance between executive, judicial, as well as the parliamentary institution has restructured under Georgian rule? I mean, the Georgian Dream's rule.
The Georgian Dream used this uncertainty and worsening geopolitical situation to strengthen its positions and its dominance over the opposition parties and whole society by increasing total control on every, let's say, field and every aspect of daily life, from parliamentary to judiciary, from court to executive. It means that right now we see the rise of the Georgian Dream in terms of its consolidation. In the near future, we most likely will be witnessed of how ruling team will minimize any external and internal threat in terms of their dominance and political control. And in this regard, upcoming 2 or 3 years will be years of stagnation of this country. And the only hope that right now a lot of Georgians have is the following, that the West and international partners will not forget this Eastern European country, which unfortunately, even in Georgia, very often is considered mistakenly. A lot of Georgians believe that Georgia is the most important country right now in Europe, and that without Georgia, free Georgia, they won't be democratic or prosperous Europe. Unfortunately, it's not the truth. And this solution outsourcing will not help in the long run. That's why, first of all, we have to understand the gravity of the situation, and we are in this phase in Georgia, in this phase. And after that, and after the potential peace deal between Moscow and Ukraine, more things will be clear, and I'm pretty sure that the West, collective West, will have more well-defined, betterly defined policy and strategy towards Georgia.
Right. But looking at the government right now, at least in some level, the rhetoric is still saying that they want to stay on the EU trajectory. But like you mentioned, it does seem like realistically they're straying away from it, especially when it comes to value. What purpose does it have to continue this rhetoric? Who is it useful for? And do you think that at some point there will be a mask-off moment where they just kind of drop this idea altogether?
Sure, they're already preparing the ground for this political move. And as for the current actions of the Georgian Dream to keep repeating that that they are still the pro-Western force, and that their main task is to integrate Georgia into the NATO and the European Union, first of all, is caused by the fact that the vast majority of Georgians, at least more than 70% of them, support countries' Western orientation. And of course, it's not possible to change everything immediately, because it is related to unpredictable risks. From this point of view, their strategy was quite smart. They are decreasing the dependence and the rhetoric related to the West slowly, day by day, by using different propaganda methods, psychological operations. And at a certain point, the Georgian Dream will cut off almost every contact with the Western institutions and international partners, and it is already visible, and it can be already understood through the statements and declarations that are made by the decision makers in Georgia. That's only the question of time. And in this regard, there won't be any surprises. In the near future, Georgia most likely will restore its diplomatic relations with Moscow. But I doubt that this restoration of diplomatic relations will be productive and beneficial to Tbilisi.
All right, so a very bleak outlook ahead. But in the meantime, thank you so much for helping us unpack all of this. Really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on Eastern Express.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. Tough negotiations concerning ending the war in Ukraine are still ongoing. Kyiv is very clear as to what it wants to achieve, and for now, the ball seems to be in both America and Russia's respective courts.
Ukraine is pressing the United States for long-term security guarantees as part of ongoing discussions about ending the war. President Volodymyr Zelensky has said current proposals outline US guarantees that are meant to last for 15 years, but Kyiv wants commitments extending several decades to prevent future Russian aggression. Zelensky says that any peace agreement must have a strong democratic mandate. He believes that a final deal could be approved either through a nationwide referendum or formal ratification by Ukraine's parliament and the US Congress. Ukrainian officials say that such an approach could avoid repeating past failures, including the Budapest Memorandum, which provided political assurances but lacked enforcement. Negotiations reportedly include a broader peace framework, though major disagreements remain over territorial control and enforcement mechanisms.
Russia is continuing down the path of international isolation. Vladimir Putin has essentially completely shut the country off from any sort of international jurisdiction and criticism.
Vladimir Putin has signed a law allowing Russia to disregard criminal rulings issued by foreign and international courts. Under the new law, Russian authorities are no longer required to recognize judgments from courts outside Russia unless a specific treaty forces them to do so. The move is regarded as an effort to shield Russian officials and military personnel from potential prosecution abroad, particularly when it comes to the war in Ukraine. Moscow has long ignored institutions like the International Criminal Court and has accused Western institutions of political bias. Observers warn that the law further isolates Russia from international legal norms and undermines mechanisms designed to hold individuals accountable for serious crimes.
Despite all the ongoing attempts at peace, the fighting in Ukraine rages on. What's more, it seems that the Ukrainian population will not settle for giving Russia even an inch of their land.
Public opinion in Ukraine continues to show strong resistance to territorial concessions. Recent polling shows that more than 3/4 of Ukrainians oppose formally recognizing Russian control over occupied territories in exchange for ending the war. On the front lines, fighting remains intense in southern Ukraine, particularly in the Zaporizhia region. Diplomatic efforts are continuing alongside the fighting, with Ukraine and its partners discussing potential peace plans and long-term security arrangements. Despite these talks, Ukrainian officials maintain that any agreement must preserve the country's sovereignty and territorial integrity. For now, the war shows no immediate signs of ending as military and political pressures persist on multiple fronts.
And that's all on this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.